Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harilos Anisiris, and this is my YouTube channel, Greco Chess. We are going to take a break from the series of facing the chess.com bots. We have beaten all the beginner bots, and we are ready to start with the intermediate ones. We're going now to analyze a game that was sent to us by one of our subscribers. His name is Alex Fox from the United Kingdom, and his online rating is 1059. His opponent has a rating of 1138. We sent a message to the opponent asking for permission to reveal the real name of the opponent. The opponent has not yet replied, and so to be on the safe side, we are not going to reveal the identity of Alex's opponents. We're just going to mention Alex is a subscriber, and on the other side of the board is the opponent. With 1059 versus 1138, Alex was not the favorite. In fact, the odds were against him. But we're going now to see what actually happened on the chessboard. A few words before we begin. Alex had the black pieces, a subscriber had the black pieces, and his opponent had the white. In addition, the time control was 3 days per move, which means that each of the players had 3 days to reply. Something else, this was what is called a thematic game, which means that for the first 2 moves, the players had no choice. There was an opening ready for them from scratch, and they would continue playing after the opening. And let's start first to see what was the thematic opening. The knight goes to f3 for white, the pawn goes to d5 for black, and the pawn goes to g3 for white. The players had no choice, they had to follow these moves. And as you're going to see on the computer analysis to the right, this is a book move. Time for black to play for the second move, and Alex moves his knight to f6. We're still in a book move. His opponent places the bishop on g2, fianchettoing, another book move, and Alex moves the pawn to e6. Again, book move. Short side castling for white. Bishop goes to e7 for black. Knight goes to c3 for white. Until here, until this move, we were book moves. But the fifth move for white, according to the computer, is an inaccuracy. The computer would rather have the pawn go to c4. The knight going to c3 means it's blocking the pawn and cannot go to c4. That is why it's considered an inaccuracy, a small one, of course. Black sends the pawn to c5, which is the best. White sends the pawn to d3. Until now, we're still in the opening. The players are developing the pieces. Knight goes to c6. Not all moves are perfect, but most of them are good, at least good. And they don't create any major differences. Bishop goes to g5. Short castling for now for black. Pawn goes to a3 for white. This is usually what's called a prophylactic move to avoid the knight coming to b4. If knight comes to b4, then the queen needs to guard the pawn at c2, and that's not the best possible role for a queen, just to guard the pawn. And black asks the question, the bishop sends the pawn to h6. Now the bishop has either to go, in fact, it cannot go back to h4 because then the pawn to g5 will take the bishop. So the bishop either needs to exchange the knight at f6, which the computer thinks is the best possible choice, or otherwise send it back, either to f4 or to c1. Instead, white sends the bishop to d2. It's okay move, not one of the 3 best, but not that different from them. Saves the bishop. In addition, it gives a second protection to the knight c3, so the pawn is not stuck at b2. Pawn goes to e5. Black gains more space. Pawn goes to b3 for white. which the computer thinks a mistake. Why is a mistake? Because now the knight on c3 depends only on the bishop on d2. You'd rather have your pieces have as much protection as possible and not have one piece stuck in defending another. Black attacks the knight by moving the pawn to d4. However, you're going to see that this is not the best. The reason being that every time you push a pawn, you may create a weakness, and that's what's happening. You lose control of the e4 square, and white takes immediately advantage of that. So knight goes to e4. And black replies by sending the pawn to b6, which the computer thinks a blunder. Why the blunder? Of course, black was thinking to push the bishop to b7 and fianchetto and challenge the long diagonal, but it comes a little bit too late, and you're going to see why. White sends his knight from f3 to e5. This the computer thinks a brilliant move, and we're going to see later why it's a brilliant move. On the surface, it seems that you're losing a knight for a pawn, but black realized that if you take the knight, knight takes knight check, and then bishop takes rook. And that's why black decided to reply by sending the bishop to d7, which is a mistake. A small loss becomes now an even bigger loss. White will take the knight with a check on f6. It's a miss because you don't get the full advantage as you wanted. Bishop takes knight. Knight takes knight on c6. Bishop takes knight, and now bishop takes bishop. We ended up this series of combinations, this series of almost forced moves, and white is quite ahead. 4.91, almost a rook. The rook is 5-0-0, 5 pawns ahead. Rook goes to c8 to force the bishop to go back. Bishop goes back to c2, excuse me, to g2, still controlling the long diagonal. Rook goes to e8, controlling the semi-open e5. Rook goes to b1 for white. Why does white do this move? Because white does not want the bishop to be facing the rook on e1 to face the bishop at f6. For the time being, there's a pawn at d4, but if any combination results in the loss of d4, the rook in a1 will be in danger. That's why the rook moved to b1, not to have to worry about it. And queen goes to a7, attacking the pawn at t2 twice while it's defended only once. White pushes the pawn to b4, and black pushes the pawn to c4. And here, move number 19, white makes a big blunder. Bishop goes to b7. It's a case of what they call a blindness. White was dreaming of attacking the rook at c8, but did not see that the bishop at b7 was completely unprotected, and queen takes bishop. Let me tell you, these kind of mistakes, when you analyze the game after the fact, they seem so ridiculous and so obvious, but when you play the game, whether in person or online, it's not easy to see them. One is so much emotionally involved, with so much looking at parts of the board that it's very easy to miss these things, even at the highest level, let alone at the level just barely above 1,000. But white continues playing, takes the pawn on c4, rook takes the pawn on c4. Bishop goes to f4. Bishop controls now the second longest diagonal from h2 to b8. And black places the rook at c3. It's near white's territory. It's a good position. And that's why white does not like it and would rather exchange. White sends the rook to b3, and we're going now to have an exchange. At this point, the score is more or less even. The evaluation is more or less even for the two players. White had a huge advantage, but lost it after misplacing the bishop on b7. Queen goes to d5 now. Queen is at the center of the board. The computer would rather have the queen be on e4 in order to attack the pawn on e2, have an even better position. But it's not a blunder. White tries to gain more space by pushing the pawn to h4. White computer would rather have the queen go to d3 to be near the center. Black replies by sending the pawn to g5. We change now on g5. You see, still black seems to have a very small advantage of minus 0.4. That doesn't mean too much, especially at that level. White will save the bishop by sending it to e3. You're going to see what happens. Black cannot take the bishop on e3. If they take it with the pawn, queen is lost. If they take it the rook, they lose an exchange. Queen goes now to e5. Now the bishop is in danger because there is no pin, and if the bishop stays here, it is lost by the pawn. That's why bishop goes to d2, and now black is going to take the pawn at e2. It's attacked twice, defended once, so it's a free pawn. Black will send the rook on e1. You understand, the black queen is attacked twice, defended only once. That's why black can do something, and what he actually do is exchange on d1. Black rook goes to e2. The ideal place for a black rook is on the second rank. Here it is not that ideal because it has almost no freedom to move, at least horizontally. But if he can stay there, it's going to be a huge advantage. White tries to figure it out by sending the king to f1, and black defends it by pushing the pawn to d3. Computer doesn't like it. Computer would rather have the bishop on, would rather have the rook go back to e7. Now bishop goes to e3, and really the rook is constrained, cannot go back. It can only move along the second rank, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares are not accessible. It only has these three here. Rook is now going to a2 to attack the pawn at a3. But the pawn moves to a4. Black moves the pawn to g4, which the computer thinks a mistake. The idea behind that is to give more freedom to the bishop on f6. Computer would rather have the bishop go to c3 to attack the pawn on b4. White takes the pawn at e3. And it's good that he took it because the pawn is not far away from promotion. Rook goes to c2 for black. Rook goes to d7. The same way that the second rank is the best for the black rook, the seventh rank is the best for the white rook. In fact, here, the white rook is quite free. The computer gives an advantage of 4.24 for white, and you may think why, because materially, white differs by only 1 pawn. The reason of the big advantage for white is that if rooks and bishops are exchanged, then white is basically winning the game because of the 3 versus 2 pawns. A passed pawn is going to create along the queen side, and white promotes. When the material becomes less, even a small material advantage can mean quite a lot. Bishop goes to c3. White sees they cannot save the pawn on e7. Let's take a pawn. Rook takes on e7. Bishop takes on b4. But now the advantage for white becomes even larger because if rooks and bishop would disappear, it would be much easier for white to exchange pawns and have a passed pawn on the A or B files. Bishop goes to d4 for white. Rook goes to c6 for black to defend the pawn on b6. White checks on h8. King goes to h7. King goes to e2. Yes, we need to activate the kings. The computer doesn't like it. The computer would rather have the rook go to a7 and threaten the pawn at h7. But during the game, when you don't have access to the computer, you go according to general principles. Near the end of the game, activate your king. Black wants to exchange the bishops because black realizes if everything is exchanged, then not excuse me. If bishops are exchanged and we only have rooks, then rooks can possibly get a draw. White does not want to exchange bishops and considers a blunder. Bishop goes to e5. Why is this a blunder? If you'd like, you may want to pause your video, don't look at the analysis, and tell us why was this a huge mistake from white that will basically decide the game. Hopefully you thought about it, and the reason is because the rook goes to e6 and pins the bishop. The bishop cannot go anywhere because it exposes the king, and it cannot be saved. White will try to check with the rook, but if there was a pawn on g6, it would be a checkmate, but there is no such thing. So king can escape to g6. Rook goes to g8. Now another check. King goes to h6. And now white desperately tries to save the bishop by moving the pawn to f4. This is not going to work. First of all, there is a move that black actually did, but even if that move was not available, then moving the pawn to f6 would mean that the bishop is lost. What black actually did is take the pawn with en passant. Pawn is lost. And now rook takes the bishop for black. At this moment, black has quite an advantage. It's 3.6. Has a bishop for a pawn, which means that if black plays carefully, black should win. But pawns are much more valuable near the end, so black should better be careful and not take the win for granted just because you have an extra bishop or a bishop for a pawn. White tries to postpone the inevitable by checking at h8. He goes to g7. And white saves the rook by sending it to h4. Rook goes to e3 check. And black will send the king to f4. What's happening here is that the black defends the rook only by the bishop. So if white was able, one way or the other, to not take the bishop, just move it away, or if exchanged or moved away from the diagonal or anything else, then the rook would be lost. But this is not possible because even if the pawn goes to b4, the rook is not going to take the pawn, but go down to d4. Now, black wants to avoid any such scenario. That's why black also takes the pawn at b3. King goes to f5. And black takes the pawn on g3. Black's advantage now is quite large. And white does something that should not be done. White is already down material, and the last thing you need is exchange. So long as there is material, then black might blunder material and you may come back, but with the rook going to g4 check, we exchange material. And now black's advantage was even larger. And at this point, you see the M in front, which means with best play, black can mate in 22 moves. Let's see what happened, because it's very difficult, if not impossible, for any human to see there is mate in 22 moves. You may see the general principle of how you can win the game, but that's all. Let's see. Was black able to win? Let's see the various parameters. Black has a bishop and 2 pawns. One of them can be stopped perhaps by the white, the other cannot. So even if this pawn on b6 is lost, black has enough winning material. Black is going to send the king to f6, which means mate in 18 moves, as you can see. White sends the king to f4, king goes to e6, e4 for white, king goes to e4, and king goes to d6 for black. At this point, the white king cannot go to d4, but it's controlled by the bishop, goes to d3, and black sends the king to d5. And white will send the king to c3, and black is going to send the king to their king to e4. It's move now 53, and white resigned. So a subscriber, Alex Fox, was able to win against a higher rated opponent. And let's look now at the review. What does the computer have to say about this game? You may see the ups and downs. You may see that there were 2 parts where white had an enormous advantage, but then black came back and won. In fact, the percentage is 74.1 for white, 76.5 for black. The ratings, according to the computer, both players played for a rating of 1800, which is much higher than their actual ratings. As I mentioned before, white had 1059 and black had 1138. Brilliancies, white had 1 versus 0 for black. Great, 1 for white, 2 for black. Best moves, 17 for white, 19 for black. Excellent, 11 versus 10 for white. Good moves, 7 for white, 5 for black. Book moves, the first 4 were book moves. As I mentioned before, the first 2 moves for white and 1 for black were made automatically because this was a thematic game. Inaccuracies, 5 for white, 3 for black. Mistakes, 4 for white, 6 for black. Misses, 2 for white, 2 for blacks. And blunders, 1 for white and 1 for black. I would like to congratulate our subscriber Alex Fox for defeating a higher rated player, and especially twice was down, but twice came back and was able to win the game. We're going to continue with the next game, and the next video is going to be the next bot. As I mentioned before, it's time now for the first intermediate bot, which is Maria from Mexico with a rating of 1000. Lessons to learn, especially at the level around 1000, be very, very careful with tactics. Make sure you don't miss pieces. In the game, we had white lost the bishop because they sent it unprotected to a square where it could do nothing. And black lost a bishop because they put it in a square where the no, I'm sorry. Also, white lost a bishop because they put it on a square where the black rook could pin it and win it. At that level, if you can avoid these tactical errors, that's what you usually need in order to win. But for their level, I believe that both players played quite well. Alex, once again, congratulations. And my fellow viewers, if you would like us to analyze, to go through any of the games, we'll be glad to do so. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the ones that have subscribed. If you have not, please consider subscribing. And of course, thanks to the people that click the like button and to the ones that have left some nice positive comments. We'll continue, as I mentioned before, by playing against Maria from Mexico, the intermediate pot. This is Harry Lauseniziris and the Greco Chess channel. Ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.